Okay, let's just get started. Hi, Nina.
Hello.
You.
Good.
Unfortunately, there hasn't been any NEMA meetings for us to cross paths in the last year or so.
I know.
Well, welcome everyone to today's talk. Um, if you have a question later for Nina, we'll have time after her presentation for conversation. Just please send me a message in the chat box if you have one, and I can unmute you when it's your turn. Just be sure to introduce yourself when asking your question. So today's speaker is Nina Zaneri. Nina has been the executive director of the Paul Revere Memorial Association since 1986. Previously, she was a curator at the Rhode Island Historical Society, and she also has an MA in Anthropology Museum Studies from Brown University. She served as a board member and officer of several professional organizations, including vice chair of the American Alliance of Museums and president of the New England Museum Association. Under her leadership, the Paul Revere Memorial Association was awarded a Boston Preservation Alliance Award, an American Association for State and Local History Leadership and History Award, and a Massachusetts Historical Commission Preservation Award in 2018. As director, she won the NEMA Lifetime Achievement Award in 2015, and she was a Commonwealth Award finalist in 2019. It's my pleasure to welcome Nina Zaneri.
Well, hello, Ron and everyone. Thank you. As you heard, I got my degree from Brown, my master's degree. So I'm honored and excited to get the invitation to chat with you today. I want to leave plenty of time for questions, but I also want to sort of give you a broad sense of where my life is. As you heard, I've been in the field for 40 years, at my museum for over 30. And during that time, the association has weathered economic downturns, political shifts, celebrity visits, 2 near gas explosions, a bomb scare, a threat, a theft, a serious nearby fire, 9/11, the marathon bombing. And while all of those moments were nerve-wracking or gut-wrenching, the recovery was quick and more knowable by comparison than what we've all faced in the last year. And I think that's the big change. It's been a non-stop cascade of shifting expectations and regulations that have left most of us dazed, frustrated, and confused. When to close, when to reopen, should we reopen? State and city guidelines that didn't line up, safety and comfort of staff and visitors. The disruption of this pandemic moment has been exacerbated clearly by political and racial strife, and also severe weather and fires that have further given us a sense that climate issues really need to be addressed. So challenges and opportunities have abounded. How do we address the need to be more inclusive in the stories we tell, more inclusive in who we employ to share those stories, and more inclusive in who leads our organizations? How do we begin to make our landmark buildings more resilient to face climate impact? How do we balance all the competing aspects of history organizations, which are more complex than most people realize? We're small businesses, tourist venues, community resources, educational facilities, shops, and we're responsible for delivering on interlocking themes of preservation, public history, and the arts. And personally, I would say it's that complexity that draws me to it, but also can give me headaches sometimes. So that's not so bad. But now, here's what we've added. Some new things. The realization of how vulnerable we are despite the presumed benefits of modern life. Vulnerable to a new and widespread illness, and an onslaught of filtered and unfiltered news and facts. I'd be lying if I didn't admit there were more than a few times when I thought, I'm not up to this. Why am I still doing this? Why didn't I retire? Having to balance the demands of each day and plan for the future with no clear end in sight and no prior playbook is exhausting. And for someone who's run on my gut for a lot of years, it's really tested that. It's been hard not to let the events of 2020 overwhelm every presumed truth, every gut instinct, and every hopeful thought. On the other hand, and there's always another hand, there's a real upside to these challenges. Being closed to the public gave my staff and me a break from serving large numbers of users. We had time to catch up a bit. And also, we had the excitement of looking at new virtual platforms and delivery options. Even though that's been taxing, it's really been interesting. We were rotating in to check our buildings through the whole pandemic. We returned fairly quickly to being in our offices. And I do think that helped keep us grounded. I know other people have been mostly remote. We have been in the office and reopened. So I would judge my organization bruised, but not broken. So to set the stage, who were we pre-COVID? Due to our very high attendance, now north of 275,000 people per year, we long have fought the tourist trap label. Research and writing and traveling exhibits, both our own and from others, have really worked to shift that perception. At least that's what we believe. My institution has grown and changed, including adding a $4 million education and visitor center that opened in 2016 and made the Revere House fully accessible for the first time, which was really something that we are quite proud of and continue to be very happy about. We have an endowment that was created when I arrived at the association. It was one of the first things I did. It is now well over 5 million, and we had a budget about 1.5 million. We are an AAM accredited organization, and we are part of the Mass Cultural Council UP contingent, which focuses on human-centered design and access for all. Our mission, which we tweaked when we did our strategic plan in 2018, is to inspire a deeper appreciation for the relevance of American history by sharing the life, legacy, craftsmanship, and iconic home of artisan, businessman, patriot, and citizen Paul Revere. We achieve this by sharing meaningful and remarkable educational experiences for all our audiences, being thoughtful caretakers of our 3 significant historical properties and our collections, and serving as a community resource. This focus includes efforts to contextualize our 3 historic structures within their near 400-year history by looking at all the residents of our properties and also transitions within our North End neighborhood. Now the COVID reality. The biggest impact, I believe, for us has been a loss of momentum. We had our institutional race car all tuned up and ready to go. After opening our new building at the end of 2016, we had fabulous years in 2017, 18, and 19. And January and February of 2020, we had near record levels of attendance. And I thought, here we go. We're ready to really roll. Then March rolled in, and we braced for what we all thought was a 2-week shutdown, which at the time seemed like a million years for a place that's open 350 days a year. We all thought, hey, we can do this. It's just a small pothole, or as Monty Python would say, just a flesh wound. But as we went on hiatus, widely pivoting, and I do hope we stop saying the word pivot pretty soon, to gain control, we quickly realized, along with everyone else, that this was very different. The small pothole had flattened all 4 tires, and we had one of those small hand pumps that you use to inflate a basketball to try to get ourselves back on track. Of course, the closure and our still severely restricted capacity and modified operations continue to have a dramatic impact on our finances. Still, we made a commitment to retain all staff, knowing that they are the most critical resource we have. We decided and agreed, board and staff, and myself included, to run a deficit, my first, by not sacrificing staff to close the gap. I know a lot of institutions have had to make really tough decisions. We were lucky. We were helped by the fact that we were in a really good place when we closed. We had cash and a healthy endowment. Still, it's very hard to replace 1.3 million in earned income. 1.3 million. I can't tell you how often I looked at that number and made my stomach just hurt. I would sit at my kitchen table with my head in my hands thinking, how are we going to do this? And I'm sure I wasn't alone. I'm sure there were a lot of people with their heads on their kitchen tables, especially directors. We applied for everything to bridge the gap. We contacted donors. We looked at government programs like the PPP loans. We tried to work our way through the bureaucracy. And I will have to say that some of the grant programs were shockingly so ordinary and refused to realize that what we all needed was unrestricted operating funds, not another program or project to apply for. So that's my one ugly comment about some of the granting opportunities that were out there. They really needed to push operating support to institutions, and some did. We knew that the shift to remote couldn't replace the income from in-person visits and programs, but it did give us a tool that we know we'll use going forward. It also took advantage of some opportunities that were out there. We had a lot of vendors who reached out to us and said, hey, we can build an app, we can give you a deal, we can work on this with you. And we did take up an opportunity to work with a team of engineers at BU who are working on a 360-degree photography and 3D object tour opportunity, which we're exploring. We did decide not to look at short-term programmatic fixes. Everything had to be grounded in our current strategic plan. We also knew that given distancing and capacity limits, we would need to refashion how we give tours once we reopened. We moved from a self-guided to a guided format. And we actually had become a little disappointed with our self-guided format. So having to do guided tours is teaching us, I think, something about how we want to deal with visitors as our numbers pick back up. So where are we now, both with regard to issues of DEAI and COVID recovery? Certainly who we are as an organization and who I am as a leader, for good or ill, have dictated our response. So what has shaped that? Because I've been doing this for a long time, I try to view each crisis with a wait and see demeanor, unless it's an emergency. So rule number one, don't run into the fire unless there's a life to be saved. Rule number two, do I have all the data I need to make a good decision? Do I have time to give it 24 hours? Will the lack of a response be viewed as a response? And does that matter? Rule number three, do I need additional outside help? Should I call a friend? And I will say throughout this process, and Ron, in fact, alluded to not being able to get together, the museum field has, as it always has, been there as a resource. I can't tell you the number of times I've reached out to colleagues just to have a phone conversation, see how they were doing, or them calling me to see how I was doing. And that's been a really, really great part of this. So again, do I have all the, do I need to reach out for help? Do I need a board member to talk to or another expert? Rule number four, you really need to know what makes your organization special and unique. Don't rush off in a direction because everyone else is doing it if it isn't a good fit and isn't sustainable. It's what your mother told you. Just because everyone else is doing it doesn't mean you should or get to. Teddy Roosevelt once said, do what you can with what you have where you are. And I think that's a pretty good place to start. Rule number five, public history is important. We need well-crafted public history now more than ever. At the Revere House, our job is to add to what visitors bring with them, to allow visitors to explore the unfamiliar. There was a recent article on Colonial Williamsburg in Politico that noted we have the opportunity, quote, to craft stories that bring fresh respect along with a different level of understanding to places of American history. Studies indicate that museums are trusted, so we must constantly work to earn and maintain that trust. We need to remind ourselves that we make educated assumptions using the fact base we have, while knowing that the fact base is flawed by the biased, idiosyncratic process of how the past has been saved and how memory is created. A more layered understanding of the events that haunt historic places doesn't diminish their power. It makes them rich and complex, troubling and joyful, filled with human folly and heroism. At my site, we have undergone a continual process of rethinking and updating our interpretive framework. However, that process has taken on new importance. On a very basic level, from a thematic perspective, I believe that many of us now have a better appreciation of how health crises played out in the past. It's far easier to imagine Paul Revere quarantined with his family at home after one of his children was diagnosed with smallpox. Unable to work as much as he needed to, he certainly had concerns about how he would provide for his family and if his silver business would survive. How familiar does that sound to us now? Later in his life, as president of the Board of Health, Revere worked to advance common sense protocols to promote healthier practices and to remove or at least mitigate unnecessary sources of germs and contagion. Of course, for Revere, that was telling people that letting water sit in pools and attract flies wasn't good. Animal carcasses left to rot in the street wasn't a good idea. Not cleaning out your privy was probably not a good idea. For us in this current pandemic, it seems it is the rather simple measures, masks, distancing, and hand washing, that provide the best measures of protection as we wait for a vaccine and now are getting vaccines. So it's not the rotting animal carcasses anymore, it's the masks and the distancing. Of course, we're also experiencing a tipping point on issues of justice and equity. So much of the history we learn is linked to memory, and in many cases, beloved national mythology. In part, our success as a museum is directly tied to how often Paul Revere's name continues to be evoked. Talk about beloved national mythology. We are loaded with it. It provides us with the challenge and opportunity to use Revere's legacy and popularity to share the names of lesser known characters. Dawes and Prescott and all the many riders out on the evening of the morning of April 18th and 19th, we can tell their story. Samuel, an enslaved man who served Robert Howard, the first owner of the Paul Revere House. We can say Samuel's name. Deborah Sampson, who was initially denied her military pension, though she served in the American Revolution disguised as the man, and who Revere helped ultimately get that pension. We can speak her name. Thomas Ayres, Revere's son-in-law, who Revere helped when mental illness overcame him as others in the family turned a blind eye. And even Mrs. Santasuoso, who ran a grocery store in the Revere House before it was restored. She was the last tenant to leave in 1906. So Mrs. Santasuoso and all the people who lived in, owned, or worked at 19 North Square before and after the Revere family. Our task is to speak the names of those whose history has been forgotten or marginalized as they intersect with Revere's legacy and the long history of our properties. Also, we are newly aware, although it shouldn't have been such a surprise, that while we so often begin the history of our site in 1630 when Boston was settled, we need to remind our visitors that the story begins when indigenous people came to the Shawmut Peninsula to live and access resources. Indeed, the first owners of the land where the Revere House sits were the Massachusetts. Our goal is to be better, to be more authentic, to be more welcoming by remembering that it's the shared experiences of life that bind us. I'm very fortunate to have had the opportunity to spend most of my career at one remarkable place. I've had a very supportive and engaged board. Yes, you heard that, a very supportive and engaged board. The few times that I've gotten out on a limb, I have not looked back to see them sawing it off, but actually lending me a hand to drag me back. My senior staff team has taught me so much about how to do history in ways that are compelling, creative, and even fun. And in the last year, they've done all that and more. And like good GPS, we've had to recalculate and recalculate and recalculate. But as a team process, I've learned a lot. Everything comes down to challenges and opportunities and knowing which ones to address and in what order, which ones to embrace or to leave for another day or to reject out of hand. So after all of this, why am I still optimistic? I've seen the demise of history museums and history predicted time and time again. Yet here we are. And that's in spite of the fact that history as presented in some history museums doesn't seem relevant, isn't done well, and often seems that people just don't care about history. What we do have is the opportunity to win folks over to the value of history at any moment in their lives. Take me. In spite of never having had a good history teacher until college, I had the basketball coach in high school for every history class. But even as a child, I loved history. History was reading Johnny Tremain and Little Women with my mother and visiting historic sites. I'm optimistic because history is essentially the story of us. I'm optimistic because I see what so many of my history museum colleagues are doing. They may not be rewarded with the numbers of visitors they should have for their efforts, but they are having an impact. Maybe the threats of the demise of history museums have forced us to be more creative. The MHS put out a recent collection of essays on the future of history that you might want to take a look at, edited by Conrad Wright and Kate Viens. Of course, it was before the pandemic, but it's still useful. I also recommend the Inclusive Historian's Handbook, which is an online resource and very good. You know, the Revere House has done some novel things. We teamed up with the Institute of Contemporary Art, and we let artists show us how they viewed and interpreted history through art installations. These were all eye-opening, edgy, and actually fun. I'm a big proponent of fun. These efforts work because our colleagues are willing to take risks to surprise our visitors a bit by coming at a story from a different angle. Our colleagues are asking good questions of the sources that we use to develop the stories we share. I'm optimistic because I believe that real things and real places matter and have become even more important as we have moved to virtual experiences. Objects and places can transport you with their very existence and then amaze us again. We understand that documents must be scrutinized to tease out both purposeful and unintentional bias. We know that objects must be mined for the many layers of meaning that they have. I'm strangely optimistic because we've never needed a historical perspective more than we do today, at a time when politicians and the media on all sides miss the complexity and nuance of history to score a political point. History museum professionals understand that history is only useful when we embrace it in all its complexity. At a time when shouts have replaced reasoned dialogue, I urge us all to consider the need to be open to dialogue from all sides, particularly those we disagree with. One of my good colleagues, Christy Coleman, who was at the Civil War Museum in Richmond and now is at Jamestown, recently noted, quote, "I'm looking for a fullness in the narrative, reasoned discourse that embraces the idea that different people have different opinions." Her plea is so telling. It underscores the need for history museum, in fact, all museums, to prevent a balanced narrative, to listen to our audience, and to strive to find common ground, to consider expanding the narrative rather than removing stories. to consider that when we share difficult truths with a skeptical audience, if we use the smallest hammer possible to make our point, we may actually strike a chord with the very folks who need to hear it the most. And at this point, a word about kindness. In the course of reassessing historic truths, at the moment when we disprove the long-held truth or cherished myth, we need to remember to give our audiences a moment to grieve so they can move forward with us to a new understanding and a shared history. I'm optimistic because I believe that we have the capacity to drive civil and informed conversation through our presentations and examinations of the past. By realizing that while some historic ideas and beliefs have never been acceptable behavior, many things we don't like don't rise to that level. By being comfortable with the one immutable historical fact we can count on, that our interpretation and perspective is one new fact away from being altered. History is wonderfully messy, distant, current, and compelling. Sharing this shifting interpretation is both the past and the future of history and history museums, and I, for one, continue to welcome the challenge with optimism.
Thank you, Nina.
Yep.
Just a reminder to the folks who are participating, just send me a quick note in the comment box, the chat box, just say, hey, I've got a question. You managed to anticipate just about every question I was jotting down, which is a sign of a very good talk. But along the lines of never let a good crisis go to waste, I think one of the, I think small museums and historic house museums in particular tend to be smaller ships, but more difficult to turn around, mostly because they lack the resources, the staff of other museums. Do you have any advice that you can give to smaller museums or historic house museums about how to leverage this moment to improve the way they do things, maybe to accelerate their pace of change or to be more experimental?
Well, I think that in some ways, some of that has happened because when this first happened, smaller places like, say, the Little Compton Historical Society, I know that this happened there. They realized that they could welcome back their local community in ways that they hadn't, and that their capacity restrictions weren't really capacity restrictions because they've never had that many people come anyway. So I think looking at, again, to your community, I think some of the smaller institutions that have really tried to be flexible have seen that there was support in their communities, people who just wanted to get out of the house, who would go to the open space around a historic property. We're in an urban location, so we have less open area to do outside programming. But I know that Gore Place, the Beverly Historical Society, again, Little Compton, have done a lot of outdoor programming and have found ways to use that. I do think that a lot of small museums, they get nervous that they can't move their boards. And I think that the time is over for that. I mean, I think we really have to sit down and say, we need to think about what we're all doing. And I think there is probably more open to this now than there ever has been, because it's really out there. I also have seen some small places take advantage of fundraising locally, again, reaching out to some of the local businesses that are struggling and sort of sharing that struggle with them and saying, you need a place to put tables for outdoor dining. Maybe we can use part of our property to do that if we have something close by. So I think it's time just to really, although I gave you 4 rules that I would never toss out, I think it's time to throw some of the rules away and just say, what can we do that's different now because of what the situation has dealt?
Thanks. we have any questions? So, yeah, the Little Compton Historical Society, I noticed them more perhaps because their director is an alum of the Public Humanities program, and they're the next town over from me. So they did a great job posting videos of tours of their properties on Facebook. Another example, I think, of a place that did really well was the Newport Historical Society, who expanded their social media, I think, in really interesting strategic ways to stay relevant. Um, the Lippert House Museum also had a very strong social media presence. Do you think social media is a good route for historic house museums to increase their relevance, to highlight their relevance, and should they continue using social media when things reopen?
Yeah, I mean, even for us, we really ramped up our social media and found that there really was an audience out there. I do think that it's an important component of what people are doing. I think you have to be careful. I think you have to think about what you're tweeting and retweeting. I think you have to think about it's sometimes a take a deep breath before you push the button kind of thing. But I do think it's important. I do think a lot of the virtual programming that people are developing is going to continue to be important as a way to reach audiences that might not come to us. But the real challenge is going to be, as we start to reopen, how do we decide what we can keep and what we can't keep up with? We have this trend in the museum field, I think, where we just keep adding things. We say, that's great, let's do that. Oh, let's do that. And instead of 10 or 12 or 14 or 15 things, now we're doing 20 things. And at some point, you have to look at that within the context of whatever your institutional planning is and say, we can't do all of this or as much of this. We posted a lot of content that we converted into a blog, which we'd never had the time to do, and we put a lot of stuff up. We also introduced something called Revere House Radio, and that takes time to produce. And I said to the folks who were doing that on my staff, I said, when we reopen, just remember, don't hold yourself to 3 blog posts a week anymore, or 2 Revere House radios a week, because you're not going to be able to sustain it. We're still doing it, but at just a reduced capacity.
We have a lot of students in the audience today, many from the Public Humanities program, who'll be graduating this spring. And I think they're looking at the contracting job market as a result of the pandemic and maybe worrying a bit about that. I think that there'll be a rebound effect when things reopen, that all of a sudden there'll be many jobs available. But do you have any advice for them, or anything to make them feel less worried about that?
Well, I do think you're right. I think it's contracted now, but I think we're going to see a very, I hope, rapid movement on that. I mean, we kept everyone, but we're now also in a hiring phase because we had some attrition. So we're actually hiring a couple of positions. So keep an eye on the Revere House. I tend to say, look at places where there's been new leadership. Often new leadership brings changes in institution that mean that job descriptions and things change, and sometimes new jobs are needed. I know that in Boston, Revolutionary Spaces, which is now the combined Old State House and Old South Meeting House, they let a lot of people go as the pandemic hit, but now they're going to start to rebuild. So I would watch institutions that did lay off folks, if you can even know that, and start to get yourself in line. I also do think that things on your resume that speak to virtual programming, digital history, social media expertise are things that people are looking for. And I think they're looking for them now more than they might have a year ago. And I just was talking to a woman who was hiring, and I was doing a reference for someone, and I could just tell from her conversation with me that those things, the virtual, the digital, the social media, were things that folks really, and she was at a small place, that people really realize that they need to do. I also think if you can show yourself to be a jack of all trades, particularly at small and mid-sized institutions, boy, I tell you, I look for that. I look for that. If you can do a lot of things and you're only missing one thing that I'm looking for, I can teach you the one thing, but I'm going to take advantage of the many things. So, and you know, have someone who hires look at your resumes. I see a lot of resumes and I just think, oh my goodness, you know, this isn't very good. This isn't what I'm looking for. And I've got to read through and tease out the things I really want to see. So if you have access, or if the public history program does resume help, I think that's something you should really take advantage of. Ask someone who hires people to look at your resume.
Thanks. That's really great advice. I have a question from Jared Bateman. He has a poor connection, so I'm going to ask it for him. How do you feel about fundraising either for Zoom meetings, Zoom lectures, or using Zoom to raise money? In other words, is it I think is it poor practice, a bad look to be raising money in the midst of a pandemic? And if you don't ask them by Zoom, how should you be raising money during a pandemic?
Well, first of all, you got to raise money if your institution's going to survive. And you have to believe that what you're raising money for has value. Yes, you're competing against other things, but the funders won't give it to you if they have another priority. So don't worry about that. You've got to make the ask. Most of the fundraising that I did initially was personal, reaching out either by email or phone to funders who I knew, funders who we had worked with before, individuals. We did, through our e-newsletter, keep a donation button there. We had a challenge grant that was given to us by one foundation, and we pushed that really hard in our e-newsletter. For our virtual programs, we've done a variety of things. We've done some free things. And at the end, we have said, if you would like to support us, go to our website. We haven't been shy about it. We've done programs that were a suggested donation. We've done programs that were free with a suggested donation. So we've done all of those things. And we've also very publicly thanked our funders when we had programs that were supported by an outside funder. So you can't, for us, I'm going to say it again, 1.3 million in earned revenue, gone, just gone. I had to fundraise, had to do it. And I mean, I think I think that you just have to craft a message that's sincere, that talks about what you do, and go with it. I think if it feels wrong, hopefully the little voice in the back of your head will tell you not to do it.
Rob Emlin has a question, and I think I'm going to let him ask it. It sounds like he's asking you to separate myth from reality. So, Rob, why don't you go ahead?
Hi. Well, there is a most improbable story about you. And I'd like you to give you a chance to affirm or deny that it took place. Everyone says that 30 years ago, you stood in the middle of North Street and faced down a city of Boston garbage truck, brought him to a stop right then and there in the middle of North Street. Is that possibly true?
It is absolutely true. Absolutely true. It's one of my board members. It's their favorite story. They love to pull that out. And they all often say, "We'll just go if I have an issue." They'll say, "We'll just go stand in front of it, Nina." But yes, I did, and I stood there, and the driver waved me over to his window, and he said, "Are you just going to stand there and not let me go by?" And I said, "Well, you need to pick up our trash." And he said, "Well, how do I know it's your trash?" I said, "Well, I'll go get a bag and open it and show you that it's our trash." He said, "No, no, no, it won't be that. You don't need to do that." So he picked up our trash, and from then on, all the guys would wave at me as they went down the street. So I have to say that Rob is a dear friend. And if you liked this talk, you should thank Rob, because he taught me how to give public. All my public speaking cues came from Rob. If you hated what I said, then it's my fault because I'm just not doing it right. But he's a dear friend, and one of my, he and Anne Levesque at the Historical Society were my true mentors. And I'll tell you folks, as you go out in the job market, if you are lucky enough to have one mentor as good as they were, you will be blessed, because most people don't. And I have tried hard with my staff to provide the same. So I'll stop now, Rob, but thank you. Thank you.
Nina, that is awfully generous of you. It's just 40 years ago we worked together, and your record since then at the Historical Society and at the Paul Revere House is, you have a national reputation for what you do. So thank you for giving me credit, but I have a feeling we played a very small part in your enormous success.
Thank you both. So we're in the middle of a pandemic, but at the same time, and maybe as a result, we're undergoing some really radical social, political, even economic changes. So there's this sort of moment where your museum is on pause, but everything is racing much faster outside the museum. Have you noticed in your visitors a change in tone, a change in questions, a change in their anxiety? And how have you adjusted to that?
Well, I'm going to say that I think the change in visitors has accelerated, or the change in visitor response has accelerated, but I think it's been happening for a while. And I think that we are, I will say, we are a site that is both the image of Revere is loved and hated by both sides. So we're in pretty good stead in that way. I think that visitors are, at least we have seen, open to a lot of topics. I think it's how it's presented. We have had a couple times when we had visitors push back on the fact that we talk about Samuel, who was enslaved by Robert Howard, or talk a little bit about slavery and its impact. Revere was not a slave owner, but he certainly benefited from the fact that many of his clients were wealthy people who had slaves. And often they push back not on the topic, but on the style of the guide's delivery. If it seems pugnacious or attacking or unwelcoming, we were talking about vaccinations. And we had a woman who sent me an email, and she said, "I understand that it's important to talk about vaccinations. It comes up. It's a historical thing at your site because of Paul Revere. It's also happening in current times." She said, "But I have religious reasons why I don't believe in vaccinations, though my son is vaccinated because my husband doesn't share my religious beliefs. I felt the guide was demeaning my saying, well, some people have reasons why they don't want to get vaccinations. And the guide said, well, I don't understand. Everyone should get vaccinated. So we had to talk about the fact that when you're talking to a visitor, you have to think about all of the ways that they may come to your topic. She was a very reasonable woman. And she just said, you have to, she said, I was made to feel bad by your guide because I don't believe in vaccinations for religious reasons. And I thought, well, that's not a good thing. We can't have that happen, I don't think. We have to find a way to deliver information that doesn't demean the listener, but helps them hear something and then take it back and perhaps build on it. I mean, we're a 20-minute visit. We have to try not to load that too heavily with expectations about where we can take people. If we take them a half an inch, that's a half an inch further than they were before. And it's tricky. It's really tricky.
Yeah, and I think many people go to museums for comfort, and I think that's maybe more true of historic house museums because there is an element of home, and home equals comfort. So that's definitely something that I think we need to remember. We have time for one more question. If anyone wants to just raise a hand at this point, then I will ask the last question. I think I've been really privileged to ask most of these questions today. So if you could pick one thing that you have done or are planning to do as a result of this pandemic that will change the way you do things in the future, what would it be?
We just did a really cool program. In 1770, you had the Boston Massacre. In 1771, Paul Revere did an event at his home that was to remind people of what had happened the prior year, to keep that anger top of mind. He did an illumination. He did 3 images and he put them in the windows of his home in North Square and lit them from behind. And the church bells tolled, and over a period of about an hour, 1,000 people walked by. And we redid that illumination this year. We did it all virtual, and actually it worked better all virtual, and that's the lesson. We were able to put it together in such a way that it allowed us to have multiple elements. I spoke for a while. We did the illumination with a costumed character who was in the street and talked about the illuminations. And then we did a typical panel with an art historian and historian on the illuminations. And then we had the artist who recreated these images for us talk about his process. And so we had all these different elements that were short, but really meaningful. And we got more great comments on that program than we have had on any other program, or maybe a handful of programs we've done in 30 years that have just been stellar. So it told me that sometimes virtual works better than in person. And you have to tease that out. And as I say, that is going to be our really great challenge as we go forward. How do we do that? If anybody's interested in the link to that program, I can provide that to you, Ron. I'd be happy to have students have a chance to look at that if that would be useful. When I'm back in the office, I'll shoot that link to you.
Yeah, please. Thank you. I think we're officially out of time. Students have got to head out to their 1 o'clock classes. So I just want to say thank you, and I'm glad that we could get together virtually. And NEMA just announced that their conference in November will be virtual again, so that was disappointing. But maybe we'll see each other in person not too long after that.
Well, I'm here in Pawtucket, so.
Okay, great. I have one Paul Revere story from my town. I'm in Tiverton.
Yeah.
And which is a very short passage from Portsmouth. So the British, of course, occupied Quinnipiac Island in 1778, and there was a lot of anticipation that they would make that jump over into Tiverton. And so a force of Americans, a few French advisors, and Paul Revere and John Hancock showed up in town to build the fort, which is still there. There's accounts by the French about the abysmal leadership and the ragtag fashion of the American forces. And not too long after, Paul Revere and John Hancock headed back to Boston. So that's my town's very brief brush with Paul Revere and his fame.
Well, I can tell you this, Paul Revere is many things. He was a lousy, lousy, lousy soldier.
As were, I think, most American colonists. They weren't here to be soldiers, I guess. So I have to run myself. I have class in about 5 minutes. So I just want to say thank you one more time, and hope to see you soon.
Thank you. It was a pleasure.
Bye, everyone.